continue today talking about, of course, ancient Greece, which I think we're up to the point where we're talking about the rise of the Greek city-states, because I know I got into talking about the Hellenic or Greek age, which started in the 8th century BC. And I think the last things I did where I talked about the types of Greek governments that they had, which I told you the two most popular were democracy developed by the Athenians, and then Sparta was known for having an oligarchy also as well. So I'm going to go ahead, like I said, I'm going to move on to talk more about ancient Greece. I think the next thing I need to lecture about and talk about is the Greek militia. That's something we need to get into and talk about for a little while as well. The Greeks didn't really have too many professional armies. If you study about the Greeks, mostly they relied on what we call militias, which are these civilian kind of armies that are kind of like almost like National Guard, where local citizens of a city-state would participate in the military. A lot of the men that fought, for these militias were mostly in the middle class, although some like Sparta were considered the elite upper class, and only a very few Greek city-states had professional standing armies. Sparta being the most famous, Macedonians later as well, you may have heard of. And predominantly most of these militias were composed of what we call hoplites. Hoplites were heavily armed foot soldiers, infantry foot soldiers, were usually armed with two main weapons, which were a hoplite short sword, and then also usually about a 9-foot spear, which was usually thrusted at the enemy, not thrown like a javelin. Hoplites also fought in a military battle formation that the Greeks developed called the phalanx. Phalanx is a Greek word meaning battle line. It was usually like a rectangular shaped battle formation. And how the phalanxes worked was that usually the Greek hoplites, in a huge mass, would basically try to drive the other phalanx or formation off the field, literally pushing them forward. And usually, literally men that would be in the back of the formation would literally push the men forward, like taking their shields and pushing them into their backs. The term hoplite you see there on the bottom comes from the round shield that the Greeks use, which is a wooden shield with usually some kind of bronze cast on it. And they call the round shield a hoplon. So the term hoplite kind of, originated from that term being used. Let me talk about the different types of armor and weapons that were used by the Greek hoplites in ancient times. First of all, let's talk about armor first. Now, there are different types of armor. Like that one you see there was a typical cuirass, which a cuirass was a type of body armor that wraps around the torso, which usually those were very heavy. If you have the weight of a cuirass, but it was something like maybe 40, 50 pounds in weight. So those were kind of like, a little bit kind of tough to, move around in that. Obviously, it might have been the strongest maybe to deflect blows. But they also had other types you can see. I could go to this one right here, but they had like what they call lamellar was another one that was real popular. They also had one that was called, I'll put it up on the screen, but it's called linothorax. So lamellar, linothorax. Lamellar was a type of layered armor that was popular, and then linothorax was a type of linen armor that they used as well. Imagine they used like leather type cuirasses were also probably also used as well. Also, they had what they call greaves, which were usually like leg armor, or sometimes even they put them on the forearms to block sword blows, etc. So that's what the greaves were, basically. Bottom right, of course, you got the round shield, which is a hoplon shield. Oplon shields were usually about 2 inches thick, made of oak type wood. They usually had a thin coating or usually put a thin casing of bronze on the outside of it to give it more strength, more or less. Also, they had different kinds of helmets. I'll go back up here and show you, but typically this kind of helmet you're looking at here was a Corinthian style helmet, the kind that was mostly used by the Spartans. So that's the kind they would use. You'll notice they have these plumes of hair on the top. Those crests were used for insignia. It's like what your rank was. So it was straightforward. That means that you were like some kind of infantry foot soldier. If it was if the crest, the plume of the hair went across the head, like perpendicular to the, I guess, the body going this way, that meant that you were some kind of officer of importance. They had different weapons. Chiefly the main weapon, which was a short sword, was usually called a xiphos. This means sword in Greek. They had different kinds. They had the longer short sword there, which I think that may have been used for the cavalry. The longer swords I know were. They also had like a curved sword too, as well. That was real popular. I think the Spartans liked it a lot. That one was, well, I think it was called a kopis, I believe was the name for the curved sword, which is right here. Then, of course, you can see they had also the hoplite spear, which was called a dory, D-O-R-Y, which dory means in Greek spear. It's usually about 9 feet in length. Like it says, you thrust it overhand, like he's doing. You don't throw it, usually. And it had 2 tips to it, usually a main tip, and the back tip was a backup tip or weight that was used with it. And Macedonians and other Greeks sometimes used what they call pikes, which were these long spears, which were later called a sarissa. And usually they were double the length of a traditional dory at about 18 feet in length. Macedonian forces under King Philip and Alexander the Great used the pikes later. And I think Hannibal's forces, when they fought the Romans, used pikes as well. Pikes have been around a long time, which are long spears. Usually they use pikes to defend against cavalry, primarily. So anyway, just kind of talking about the the military of the Greek militia and the hoplites that were the backbone of pretty much the Greek forces back then. All right, let me go ahead and move on. And of course, also talk about the rivalry between Sparta and Athens. That's something, of course, very famous that happened as well in the Greek world. Those 2 states, like out of the different Greek city-states, Sparta and Athens were the chief 2 most famous. They're also the big rivals that didn't like each other, that hate each other. It was almost like United States versus the Soviet Union, in a sense, if you want to put it that way in Greek times. And they both developed opposite different locations. Sparta developed on the Peloponnese Peninsula, also called the Peloponnesus. Hey, come on in. Anyway, and then Athens developed on the Attica Peninsula, was where they, of course, developed. So those two locations was where they developed. It's about, I forget how far, but I think it's like 100-something miles northeast of each other. It's kind of where they are, because Athens is northeast of Sparta on a separate peninsula. It's kind of like between the Isthmus of Corinth and the Peloponnese below. Of course, I'm going to first talk about Sparta, which, of course, was pretty famous as a city-state. If you know about Sparta, they were traditionally known for their military traditions. That's really the only thing they're known for, of course, is their military. Not too much else, like fighting in battles like the Battle of Thermopylae, etc. And Sparta was related to the Dorians that conquered Greece in the so-called Greek Dark Age, which they're not sure exactly the time period when they developed the Spartan state, but it was sometime maybe by the 9th, 8th century, they had created the Spartan Dorian state that's in the southern part of the Peloponnese. And the region they called it, like their country, that they called where they live, was called Lacedaemon. You can see there, Lacedaemon, Lacedaemon. Today they call the region of southern Greece there Laconia, either spelled with a K or a C. L-A-C or L-A-K-O-N-I-A. Laconia. And I think Laconia is kind of like a shorter version of Lacedaemon, because sometimes they'll say Lacedaemonia, I think was another version of it, where they'd add like IA on the end also as well. Sparta controlled two areas. If you go to this map here that I've got, where Sparta is on the this is the whole Peloponnese Peninsula, which is right here in southern Greece. Sparta controlled these two areas, Laconia, which is right here on the bottom, and then Messenia, which is to the west. They had actually these two areas they were in control of. And Sparta evidently subjugated a lot of the local peoples that were already there. I think some kind of indigenous peoples that were living in Greece at the time. They forced them to become agricultural serfs, although it's debated about whether they might actually be slaves. I think a lot of historians think they were slaves from what the Greek writer Plutarch talks about, because he's the main historian on Sparta. And over time, Sparta ruled over the whole region as an elite upper class. Nobody else had any other rights except the Spartans. And remember, I told you that Sparta was an oligarchy, just ruled by them overall. Due to the fact that the Helots heavily outnumbered the Spartans, that's why the Spartans developed a military society, because they were always kind of concerned that the Helots might overthrow them, because they're basically like slaves. I forget the number what Herodotus talks about, but Herodotus, I think, mentioned that. I think as far back as him, he talked about how the Spartans maybe were outnumbered like 7-1. So for every 7 Helot, there was 1 Spartan. And I think there was only at one point maybe 8,000 to 10,000 Spartan soldiers at one point that was, could fight. So Spartan society was totally different compared to like the Athens. Strange society. They didn't have much like sense of humor. Very serious people, the Spartans. Very little culture either. The only thing they had was, of course, their military, that they're known for today. So, of course, you go to Athens, and Athens is a very open society, all kinds of different culture in general. And so it's totally different culture, those two different states. So it's like opposite, like communism versus capitalism or something like that in modern times. All right. Now, by the way, Sparta, talking about it a little more, Sparta had a founding father I did want to talk about, and his name was King Lycurgus. He's the founding father of the Spartan state, more or less, at least the one that's the Dorian state that develops at this time. And Lycurgus is the one that pretty much developed their constitution. What I mean by constitution, I'm talking about like their courts, their assemblies, all their laws in general. So all that he helped to pretty much develop, they believe. Although some people think that Lycurgus might be kind of a mythological person. They're not sure if he existed or not, but Plutarch writes a lot about him. He's where we get a lot of information on Lycurgus. They think even the law codes were kind of named after him. I think they may have called the law codes of the Spartans the Code of Lycurgus or something like that. And then also Lycurgus was the one that developed the Spartan assembly. It was called the Apella, where all Spartan males could participate politically. And also the Agog was something else that Lycurgus developed, which was the famous Spartan military school that trained all the boys to become soldiers. And that's something I need to want to talk about, the Agog, which is something very famous about the Spartans, which you probably heard about. You know about it, Spartan boys were trained from the age of 7 to train for war. And the Spartans, from a very young age, when a baby would be born, like a male, they would check the baby to see if it was weak or not. And if you know about it, the Spartans, if a baby was weak, they would leave it somewhere to die. They wouldn't keep any weak babies. So they only wanted the strong to survive. And so from the age of 7 to 20, like 12, 13 years, kind of like going up to high school or whatever, they would train to be a soldier and also be educated in schools. And the Spartans would then, from the age of 20 to 30, would then have to live in military barracks together, kind of like the Marines or military type barracks. And when you reach 30, you then could go live on your own. And you can actually get married when you're living in the barracks, but you can't live with your wife. You have to live in the barracks. It's just kind of odd. So all the men would live together in a barrack. They would eat together, and create camaraderie, kind of like the Marines, as a group. When you reach around the age of 30 or above, you then became what they call a Spartiate. A Spartiate was a full Spartan citizen. That gave you political rights, where you could vote and hold office, etc. Under the Spartans. The Spartans, I told you before, had an oligarchy. Remember that? So only the Spartans could actually have any power. And I told you how the Spartans actually had a kind of a strange government where they had two kings that were in power, which mostly did a lot of military stuff, like running the military. Right, let me then move on, and I want to go ahead and talk about also the rise of Athens, because that's the other rival state, of course, to Sparta that we're getting into. Athens. Athens was not like a Dorian state. It was actually an Ionian state, which developed by I think the Ionians going back to the Greek Dark Age. And they developed on a separate peninsula that's kind of northeast of Sparta, I told you about 150 miles to the northeast of Sparta, on a separate peninsula that's called Attica. It's about a 1,200 mile square area. I think actually I got a map showing you where it is. You go here. Attica's right here. So this whole chunk of an area right here. And then Sparta's down here. So it's about, like I said, 150 miles, I guess if you fly by plane, from southern Greece to Attica. That's about the distance from it right there. But you got the Gulf of Corinth and all that in the way right there. And talk about Athens. Athens, of course, was more known for its Greek culture. That's the thing, of course, everybody talks about because, Athens was believed to be one of the birthplaces of what we call Greek, of Western civilization, Western culture in general. So I've talked about this before: democracy, history, philosophy, drama, architecture, religion, all these kind of things that, of course, the Athenians developed were something that they helped to influence other people later. The Greeks, influenced the Romans. The Romans influenced medieval times. Medieval times influence modern times in general. And so it all kind of goes back to the time period of the Greeks. You see a lot of buildings, with Greek type columns on them. That's something that's quite common all over the place, more or less, houses and buildings, etc. Athenians were more of a naval power. That's one of the big differences between, I guess, Athens and Sparta. Was known for its land armies, but Athens was known for its maritime and naval fleets, like the Athenian Navy. The Athenians were known for exporting a lot of goods, especially olive oil. Olive oil was their big commodity that they sold to people. And over time, what happened, which I'll get to later, Athens becomes so powerful in the Aegean that they developed their own empire. It's called the Athenian Empire, which was actually a collection of states that traded with each other in the Aegean. Most know that Athens is named after, of course, Athena, one of the daughters of Zeus. She was their main patron goddess. They built temples to her, like the Parthenon, the Athena Nike temple. And she was mostly a god of war and a god of culture and knowledge. So we'll talk about the Greek gods later, but that's, of course, where the name Athens comes from originally. Let me get into, of course, the most famous thing that the Athenians are known for, and that, of course, is democracy. They pretty much invented it and spread it to the rest of the world. And they believe that democracy, Athenian democracy, developed between the 6th and the 5th centuries BC. It was mostly due to reforms by a couple politicians that were well known. Those are the three main fathers of Athenian democracy: Solon, Cleisthenes, and then, of course, later Pericles, who ruled later in the 5th century BC. So those are the three right there that were big. The first one is Solon, which I think I've got a picture of Solon that I have. Let me see if I can find it real quick here for you. But Solon, there's Solon, a statue of him. But Solon was a famous politician of Athens that lived in the 6th century. And he was considered one of the first to come in and start making democratic reforms. Before Solon came in, Athens experimented with what I talked about before, a tyranny or tyranny. They had these tyrants running the country. And there was a guy named Draco who lived in the 7th century BC, who was an Athenian tyrant and aristocrat. He was famous for creating these harsh laws that were later dubbed draconian laws. You may have heard that term being used, draconian. And so it's kind of like now with all the lockdowns going on with the virus, et cetera. And so it's kind of like seeing some people think it's draconian, some of the things they're trying to do. Back in those days, they were very harsh. Like if you committed a crime, they would put you to death for anything. Not just murder, but theft and anything else, adultery, you could be put to death. Well, Solon comes in, he starts getting, bringing in more democratic laws. And so the only thing you can be put to death for is murder now under him. And then, of course, you can see there on the bottom, of course, Solon is the father of the Athenian constitution. He's the one that was their great lawgiver, the one that basically created a lot of their courts, their court systems, their assemblies, created all their law codes, their democratic laws, and all of that. I'll go through and I'll talk about some things that Solon was known for as a politician. He did a lot of things, Solon. One thing he did, which a lot of states were kind of trying to get rid of, but he ended all slavery for debts owed. Like, so if you owed some money, a lot of times they would put you in slavery to pay for it. Basically, they got rid of that. They even had some kind of child slavery they got rid of too, which was interesting. I encouraged all the farmers to start growing olives everywhere. And so he pretty much is the guy that helped develop the olive oil industry in Athens. He also founded their two main assemblies, like democratic assemblies, which are actually called a consul, or the Greek word for a consul is called a boule, B-O-U-L-E, boule. There's two of them. They had the ecclesia. The ecclesia was basically for all the male citizens to directly participate in. It usually could be like 30, 40,000 people could show up, and they could, directly be involved in what we call, direct democracy, literally. And the more prestigious consul was the Consul 400. He created that too, another boule. This one was a consul of 400 representatives that were elected for 1-year terms every year. And so if you got to be picked for that, that was kind of pretty big if you got on the Council 400. And how they chose delegates to the Council 400 was by lot. It could be random. So anybody can be picked. It could be you or me or anybody. And you won't even know who it is. Solon also developed, see on the bottom there, the Areopagus. Areopagus was an Athenian appellate court, which was mostly composed of all the elders, magistrates, etc., which I think most Athenian magistrates were called an archon, which meant leader in Greek. The Athenian appellate court of the Areopagus was kind of like the U.S. Supreme Court. It was like the last court of appeal for certain cases. And also, they tried capital punishment cases. Like I think famously Socrates was tried by him, and he was put to death. Solon's also known for dividing Athens into different social classes, which Athens was divided into four social classes. They had the two upper classes, which were like nobility, basically, aristocracy, and what they called knights. Middle class was the hoplites, those ones that ran the armies, the infantry, foot soldiers. Most of them were farmers or artisans. They worked with their hands, like making pottery or whatever they did. The lower classes were peasants. They were landless peasants. They just worked the land, but they didn't own any land. They were often called thets. And they often, like militarily, would row the naval ships, like in war. So they were kind of like on the bottom. Now, they think Solon left, and he was replaced by some tyrants came in, which were Pisistratus, and he had two of these sons of his, named Hipparchus and Hippias, that reigned for a short time. I think together they reigned like, I want to say, 50 years. So Athens went from a democracy back to a tyranny at that point. But eventually they were driven out again. They got rid of them around 510, and there was a Athenian politician named Cleisthenes came in, and Cleisthenes expanded democracy back. He restored it and expanded it after he came in. And Cleisthenes is one of the three main fathers of Athenian democracy, and he was known for developing the Council of 500, which replaced the Council of 400, kind of expanded it. And Cleisthenes was one of the first Athenian politicians to basically give all male citizens equal rights and also equal representation. So basically, there was like equal rights and representation from like the nobility to the middle class to all the way down to the lower classes over time. And they even divided up Athens into 10 tribes to help out and make equal representation with the assemblies, especially the Council of 500. And so each tribe could elect 50 equal delegates to it. And that's really the first example of something similar to later democracy you see with modern elections, of how they choose people. But again, they chose people by a lot. It's how they basically elected people in the old days. All right, let me go ahead and review real quick here some of the stuff we've already covered, and then I'm going to move on to talk about the Greco-Persian Wars, of course, today. What people invaded Greece during the Greek Dark Ages that began around 1200 BC? That was the Hellenes, which are what they call the Iron Age Greek peoples, named after that guy Hellen. What three main tribes these people settled around the Aegean, which the names also represented the different Greek dialects later. Mostly the three main ones were Ionian, Dorian, and Aeolian. Although really the first two are more famous. There was a fourth one named Achaean, which I know is not as well known. What is the Greek name of the city-state that emerged around the 8th century when the Olympics began? Apolis, P-O-L-I-S, or also Poli, plural. What two main historical periods make up the Hellenic age or Greek age that occurs between 776 to 323 BC? That is you got the Archaic Greece, or what we call Old Greece, 776 to about 500. And from 500 to 323, you've got what they call the classical period of Greece. Then they had the Hellenistic age, but you don't have to do that now, but I'll get to that later, from 323 to 30 BC because of Alexander the Great's conquests. What were the Acropolis Agora in the Greek city-state? The Acropolis was the high point of a Greek city, like a hill or mound that's built up on. The Acropolis was where the Greeks used that as a civic center, especially for their temples. And it was also used for military defense. Agora was a gathering place or a gathering area. That's what it means in Greek. It was where they had their town square, where they would have their markets and their assemblies, baths, and also mass entertainment for the citizens. What types of government the Greeks developed? Which did Athens and Sparta prefer? Athens developed democracy, which became the most famous, where you've got all the male citizens directly participating. Sparta, of course, had an oligarchy, which was mostly an elite type government where only the upper class ruled. They also had tyrants or tyrannies, which weren't as popular, where these aristocratic rulers reigned like a dictator. And they did have monarchies, like Sparta did have a monarchy, two of them, but they had two kings, which was kind of like a strange kind of government. Or the hoplites. I just talked about this. Hoplites were the Greek infantry foot soldiers that fought in a phalanx formation, which was a type of rectangular shape Greek formation. What types of weapons and armor did they use? The main two types of weapons they used was a xiphos, which is a Greek short sword, and of course they had the dory, which was the 9-foot spear. They had different kinds of armor, like cuirass, body armor I told you about. They had the hoplon, which is the round shield, greaves for their arms and legs protected. And of course, they had their bronze helmets that they also fought with as well. What peninsula did Sparta and Athens develop in Greece? I told you Sparta developed on the Peloponnese, for Peloponnesus. Athens was on Attica. What was the name of the ancient region where Sparta developed in southern Greece? It was called the Lacedaemon, or Laconia, which is the more modern name. Who were the helots that Spartans used to farm their land? They were basically agricultural serfs or maybe even slaves that they basically ruled over. They didn't have any rights, the helots. King Lycurgus was one of the founding kings of Sparta. He developed, of course, their constitution, their military school. What was the Agog? The Agog was the Spartan military school. What was Athens famous for as a city-state? It was mostly known for its Greek culture, like democracy, philosophy, history, etc. It also, of course, was known for maritime trade, like selling olive oil. They were also a major naval power in the Aegean. Why was the Athenian politics important to make reforms, create early democracy? He was the one that was one of the founding fathers of Athenian democracy. Told you he developed their assemblies, such as the Ecclesia, Council of 400. He also developed the Areopagus, which was their main court system. He also, I told you, created like the olive oil industry, ended debt for slavery, pretty much created all their democratic law codes. Pisistratus was a tyrant that ruled over Greece. This is after they think Solon, left, the city-state or something like that. But he reigned, and his two sons reigned, which were Hipparchus and Hippias. Tyrant, again, was a type of aristocratic type ruler that usually reigned without a constitution. And by the way, tyrants were usually very popular with the lower classes. I think I mentioned that already before. Cleisthenes was an Athenian politician who lived close to about 500, and he, of course, was famous for his democratic reforms. His big thing he did was he gave all male citizens equal rights, and he also developed the Council of 500. All right, let's continue now. Next, need to talk about, of course, the Greco-Persian Wars. At least get on that today. I don't know if I'll finish that or not. I guess I'll try to finish that today if I can. The Greco-Persian Wars. And kind of get into that next. At the beginning of the 5th century, like close to 500, we have the so-called Greco, or also called just the Persian Wars. The Greco-Persian Wars or Persian Wars, they usually dub it. And this was a major conflict between East and West that broke out. I think around 499 BC is the actual date when it started. And basically you get the Greek city-states have to fight off the Achaemenid Empire or the Persian Empire, which of course controls most of the Near East, from like India to Egypt and Turkey, which was a massive empire, of course, at the time. And of course, I've talked about this empire before. This empire, I'll show you a map of the region. It was huge. It went all the way to the Indus River basin, like over here. And then it went all the way to Egypt, up through Israel, Syria, and into Turkey. So I think it was like 40, 50 times bigger than the Greeks, their area that they were living in. I think Greece must be the size of half of Turkey or something like that right here. And I had talked about it before, but um, the Persian Empire developed under mostly two kings, King Cyrus the Great and King Darius the Great. Those two guys. Of course, Cyrus, of course, developed, remember, the empire back in the 6th century, and Darius the Great, by the beginning of the 5th century, had expanded the empire further. They pushed it more into the Mediterranean and Aegean world, where the Greeks were living at the time. And there's one area that they pushed it into that really made the Greeks all mad, and that was Ionia, which is in western Turkey. Ionia was an area that had been pretty much colonized by the Greeks, which is right here. See where it says Ionia right here. And when the Persians took this over, that caused a lot of these Greek city-states to later rebel because they didn't want to be under Persian rule, and I guess pay higher Persian taxes and things like that. And so if you study about Ionia, they believe mostly that it had been colonized by really the aid from Athens. Athens had been one of the sponsored states that really had been involved in developing them. And of course, you can see in that map where Ionia is, there's a city-state there that was famous called Miletus, Miletus, Miletus. And Miletus would eventually rebel. They're the ones that started the whole problem. And it led to what they call the Ionian Revolt, which broke out like around 499. It would last like 4 or 5 years. And so Athens then responded to help out their Ionian brothers over there in western Turkey. And so they sent their own, like a force over there, a navy and military, like an army over there to help them out. They marched actually inland into Turkey and sacked one of the Persian cities there called Sardis, Sardis, Sardis. And that really angered King Darius the Great. He was really miffed about that. And so he decided, I'm going to get back at them, and so tit for tat, it led to the war breaking out. And so Darius the Great decided he was going to try to attack Greece after that. And so eventually it does lead to two major invasions by the Persians into Greece, which occur in 490 and also 480 BC. Now, talking about, of course, the Persian Wars and all of that, I need to talk about Herodotus. Herodotus, if you study about it, was one of the main historians that wrote on the Persian Wars. A very important individual. We talked, of course, a bunch about him already, Herodotus, many times. And he was one of the first to write a historical work, of course, on anything. And he mostly wrote about the Persian Empire. He talked about, ancient Egypt in book 2, I think, of his work. And he mostly documents, of course, the wars, the conflicts. And he's where we get all the information about all the famous battles, like Battle of Thermopylae, Battle of Marathon, Battle of Salamis, that you may have heard of. And his work called The Histories of Herodotus, which has like, I think, 8 or 9 books in it, is, of course, one of the first documented historical works ever written. And so that's why everybody called Herodotus later, father of history. But he was, of course, like I told you before, prone to kind of exaggeration. And we'll talk about that later, but some of his numbers don't add up. But he's our main source, of course, on the actual conflict and battles. Now, let's talk about, of course, what happened. Now, the first thing that happened was in the conflict was that King Darius the Great, the king of Persia at the time, the beginning of the 5th century, decided to retaliate, of course, against the Greeks. And so what happened was in 490 BC, like I said, Darius sent a force to try to basically attack Athens. 30, 40, maybe even larger than that, maybe closer to 50,000 may have been involved in it. They included a naval force and an army, and they were going to attack Athens and probably, I guess, start trying to conquer Greece at that point. It led to the famous Battle of Marathon, which happened sometime in September of 490 BC. It's considered to be, by the way, one of the first major battles ever fought really by Europeans, unless you want to count the Trojan War, which we're not sure if that was really a real war or not. But Marathon is considered to be, by the way, the first major battle ever fought in European history. And of course, by the way, it was, of course, a Greek victory, of course, over the larger Persian force. And the Greeks, which were mostly composed of Athenian forces, and I think there was another state that sent forces. I believe it was the other state that was involved. Oh, yeah, Plataea. Plataea also sent some forces as well. But mostly Athenian hoplites were involved. So they had about 10,000 troops. And the Persians probably had at least 30,000 or more. So the Greeks were outnumbered like 3-1. So really heavy odds there on the Battle of Marathon. Marathon was a little Greek city-state that was kind of to the northeast of Athens, and it was on what they call the plain of Marathon. It's about 26 miles or so northeast of Athens, and that's the location where Darius the Great landed his force on the shores of Greece. And at the beginning of the battle, the Athenian forces didn't know what to do. There were several generals of the battle. They couldn't make up their mind whether they wanted to fight or not, to attack them or not, because they were worried about being outnumbered. This general, that was, by the way, a former mercenary of the Persians who kind of knew their tactics, General Miltiades, he was the one that eventually got them to attack. And he basically used kind of a flanking maneuver to attack their flanks. And eventually it turned out to be a rout. They totally got routed in the battle of the Persians. And the Greeks eventually chased the Persians back onto their ships. Here's kind of a map of the thing right there. But you can see how they kind of outflanked them on the left and on the right. And kind of like almost like a half double envelopment. And eventually, what happened was the Persians suffered such high casualties that they were forced to basically flee at that point. And the Persians really never recovered from that incident. Now, Herodotus claims that the casualties were even lopsided too, not just the battle. He claimed that the Persians took something like 6,400 casualties. The Greeks took 192 casualties. Not sure I believe those numbers, but that's kind of telling you that it was kind of lopsided. But they do definitely think that the Greeks just had better armor, they had better weapons than the Persians had. If you look at a study about the Greek-Persian Wars and even the wars, with Alexander the Great fighting the Persians, the Persians really didn't have an answer for Greek military tactics and the phalanx and all that. They just couldn't fight it, One more thing about Marathon. Marathon became famous for this messenger named Phidippides, who you may have heard of. He was like a runner, long-distance runner. They used him as a messenger, like to get help or something like that, or send messages to people. And apparently Phidippides was involved in what became known as the Marathon Run, where he ran from Marathon to Athens, which is about 26.2 miles. And he basically ran there to tell them that the Greeks had won the battle, victory, etc. And supposedly after he ran 26.2 miles, he dropped dead from exhaustion. But they're not sure if that's really a true story or not. Herodotus mentions Phidippides, but he doesn't mention the run. So some think it's a legend. There's later some kind of Greek writer writing in Roman times named Lucian mentions the story of the run. He talks about the run, Lucian, Lucian, but he doesn't call him Phidippides. He calls him Philippides. So he has different names too. And so he might be a legend. So they're not sure if it's really a true story if it happened. But Darius gets defeated, like I said, and so the Persians don't really attempt another invasion until 480 BC, and that'll be under King Xerxes the Great, his son, that'll come back later. And Xerxes the Great will actually try to really do this the right way. He'll try to bring his army over by land with a huge army and try to crush them in the second invasion. So that's what I want to talk about next, of course, and get into and talk about what happened with the next invasion. Of course, you have the second invasion, of course, of Persia that follows next. Now, according to Herodotus, which I told you how Herodotus tend to exaggerate all that. Herodotus claimed that Xerxes amassed a huge army. Actually, he claimed it was like something like 2 million men, which is got to be ridiculous. I don't think that's even correct. But he massed this huge army, like as much troops as he could across his whole empire of Persia. They think it may have been 250,000 men, 250,000 at the most. I don't know if it's that big, but it was pretty large in size. One of the largest invasion forces ever amassed in history. And what happened was he marched his forces to what is northwestern Turkey, and he crossed over into Greece at a place called the Hellespont. Hellespont is this little water, a little strait that's between the Greek and the Turkish side there. And it was famous, if you know about it. Xerxes built a bridge across it, which is like a mile long, like a mile across water. He built an actual bridge using mostly pontoon ships. It's mostly what he did. There's a famous story that Herodotus tells, which I don't know if that's true or not either, but he claims that the first bridge collapsed after they built it. And so Xerxes, being kind of superstitious, got out some men with whips, and they whipped the water with whips to try to get the water to cooperate. And then they built the second bridge, and it worked. I don't know if I believe that. That's a funny story he told. So Xerxes from there then invaded through northern Greece. He came down through Thrace, which is like up in the northern part, northern Aegean, and then came down through kind of part of Macedon or Macedonia. And then what happened was it forced the Greek city-states at that point to form kind of a defensive military alliance, or what we call a league, to fight against the Persians. And the Greeks at that point came up with this new strategy to try to stop the Persians, to kind of slow them down. And so they decided to block all the northern passes and block the northern straits, like water straits that get down into southern Greece. They did this because they wanted to try and evacuate all the citizens that were in the way of Xerxes' invading army, so they wouldn't all get captured and killed and all that, or enslaved. And then also you can see there it allowed time for the Greeks to bring up reinforcements, like from especially the Peloponnese, like Sparta and other states that could bring in forces to fight them. Now, I told you they started to block them at different spots. Thermopylae Pass, which is in Boeotia, Artemisium Strait, which is kind of east of Thermopylae Pass, above Euboea, the island of Euboea. So those all play major roles in, of course, trying to block the Persians at that point from invading Greece. At Thermopylae Pass, which I'll talk about the most, which is very famous because of the Battle of Thermopylae, what happened was the Greeks sent a small force there to Thermopylae Pass to try to block it. Only about 7,000 troops. That's all it was. It was a very small army. And they're led by a very famous king you probably heard of, which is, of course, the Spartan ruler Leonidas. I'll just use how they say it, actually. And, Leonidas, or some people say Leonidas if you want as well. And Leonidas had about 300 crack troops under him. And then he had also allies that were fighting with him too, Greek soldiers, which were Thebes and Thespia, all which were nearby in Boeotia. So they put up forces to fight, to volunteer. And so that leads to the Battle of Thermopylae, which took place August 480 BC. I'm not sure they know the exact date on it, though. Now, Thermopylae, they do know, was a 3-day battle. So it took 3 days to fight this battle. And when Xerxes got there, he couldn't believe that the Greeks were there, blocking the pass with a small army, like 7,000 men. He thought they were crazy and give up. He thought they should give up. And so what happened, if you know about it, was Xerxes told him, hey, put down your weapons. And you know what King Leonidas said to him? He said, come and get them. And so anyway, that started the actual battle right there. And what Xerxes finds out, of course, in this battle, that it's very difficult because he's unable to crack through the pass because Thermopylae Pass is very narrow. You can only get so many forces in there, which equate to what the Greeks have. And so the Persians suffer really bad casualties in the conflict. I think they suffered, like, it varies on the numbers, but anywhere from 20 to 30,000 were killed in the battle on the Persian side. Now, Xerxes, though, by the third day, he's able to break through and get around the pass because there was this Greek trader named Ephialtes who told them about this goat path that went around the pass, like a mountain pass. And so he was able to get his troops around the backside of of Leonidas' forces. And so Leonidas got surrounded from both ends of the pass, the north and south end. And so Leonidas realized that he's got to do a last stand here to try to stop him. And so he basically lets a lot of his forces go. In fact, he only leaves about maybe 1,500 men to fight with the Spartans to basically fight it out to the death, more or less. By the way, Ephialtes is a Greek word now that means nightmare in Greek, because it became a nightmare for the Greeks at Thermopylae Pass. What ends up happening, Xerxes' forces eventually wins the battle. They annihilate Leonidas' forces. In fact, Leonidas was killed, and they cut his head off, and they put it on a pike. But Xerxes kind of suffered kind of what they call a Pyrrhic victory. He basically won the battle, but he felt like he lost because he lost so many men, 20,000, maybe 30,000 at the most. And a lot of his troops were kind of demoralized after the victory. But it allowed Xerxes to drive on. He kept going, southward into Boeotia. And he would sack Thebes, and then he also sacked Athens. He basically burned the Athenian Acropolis that's there. So he burned that. But pretty much the Greeks at that point had evacuated. They got their people out at that point overall. I did have some other slides in here, by the way, you can look at later. Like, I've got a map showing you where Thermopylae is. You can see it's kind of in the upper part of Boeotia. This is all Boeotia, which is right here above Attica, which is right there. Yeah, here's the famous statue, of course, that's still there today. They put it at the site in modern times, but it's got actually the words come and, well, it should be come and get them, is what it should say, but in Greek. But anyway, so going back to what we're talking about, of course, with the second invasion. Now, what occurs, the Greeks were able to evacuate most of their people. They evacuate everybody to the island of Salamis, which is off the coast of Greece. When you go to this map here, you can see where Salamis is. It's located in what they call the Saronic Gulf. Yeah, Saronic Gulf, right there. I'll put it right here, but it's right here, Saronic Gulf, right here, between like Attica and the Peloponnese. So you've got the Persian Navy coming down here, down Attica. And then you got the Greek Navy. The Greeks under General Themistocles, who was an Athenian politician later, he basically amassed the naval forces of the Greeks in what is the Strait of Salamis. And of course, this battle became very famous in September of 480 BC, the Battle of Salamis. That battle is very important, Salamis. Salamis, if you know about it, was considered the big turning point in the war. In fact, Themistocles is considered to be one of the greatest heroes, really, of the whole Persian Wars. He helped pretty much turn the tide, more or less, with his naval skills. And what happened was the Greek Navy, even though outnumbered, I think the Greeks only had 400 ships. They say that the Persians had maybe as much as 1,200 ships, which is a lot. They outnumbered like 3-4 to 1. But the Greek Navy was able to rout the Persian Navy, mostly due to superior naval vessels. The Greeks relied on a naval vessel you may have heard of called the trireme, which is a type of warship. These were warships that used 3 decks of oars, which were used to propel the ship in battle. Also used sails. It had a ram on the front where they would ram enemy ships also as well. They believe the trireme evolved from the Phoenician bireme that had been around. These are the typical kind of warships and galleys that were built. They call it a galley ship. That's what they're actually called. And galley ships are around up to modern times. They're used for a long time, believe it or not. I think the Italians used them for a while as well. But yeah, Themistocles and his force were able to eventually defeat the Persian Navy, and so it becomes a major turning point in the war, because after that, what happens is Xerxes decides that pretty much the war, he has to give up on it because he loses a lot of chunk of his navy at that point. He lost like 200-300 ships in the battle, which didn't help, and so he's forced to evacuate his forces eventually by 480, 479, and so after that, the Persians never really threatened to really conquer all of Greece overall. But like it says there, yeah, the Persian Wars kept dragging on. It kept dragging on close to about 450 BC because they fought in the Aegean in Western Turkey. And so the Persians were, deemed as a threat, over time. Let me talk about a few more minutes, and that's probably it for now. Let me just talk briefly about what happened after the war. Now, after the war, what happened was the Greeks kind of rebuilt after the war. And what happened was the Greeks were kind of concerned that the Persians were going to come back. And so in about the mid-5th century, they decided to form a military defensive alliance against the Persians that was called the Delian League. And it involved, I forget, several hundred Greek city-states joined it. And they either sent men, arms, or money, or even naval ships to create this defensive league. And they also were hoping to push the Persians out of the Aegean, like the islands of the Aegean, or also Western Turkey. And the term Delian originated from its headquarters, which was on the island of Delos, which is in the Cyclades Islands. And so that's where the term Delian came from. And they had a temple there called the Temple of Apollo. And all the members of it would meet there, have meetings. They also would put the money in there for the treasury. Later, what happened, which I'll talk more about probably on, I guess, Wednesday, but I'll talk about Athens will take this so-called Delian League, and what they're going to do is they're going to create an empire out of it called the Athenian Empire. The Athenian Empire was a collection of mostly Ionian states that were involved in commercial trading, like throughout the Aegean Sea, etc. Athens used it to kind of control the region. And over time, it makes Athens real powerful. It's really the peak of Athens. They call it the golden age of Athens, around that time. It happens under Pericles, who I'll get to probably on Wednesday. And what's going to occur later is that it's going to create a lot of problems between Athens and Sparta, and later lead into the so-called Peloponnesian War. That's going to be one of the things that helps to kind of end the whole period of the Greek city-states and its peak power. So I'll talk about that later, kind of talk about the end of the Hellenic Greek age on Wednesday. And I'm going to also go into and talk about Greek culture. And if I have any time, I don't know if I will or not, but on Wednesday, if I have time, I might talk about Alexander the Great and the Macedonians. I'll see about that. Maybe not. We'll see later about it. So anyway, I want to remind you, don't forget about various assignments you got to complete this week, which really the only one you got to do now, I think, is the first exam. So don't forget about that to get that finished. And later, like I said, I am going to post this lecture to, of course, my YouTube channel. So that's it for today. If you have any questions or comments, let me know about it, about what kind of comments you have, of course. And that's about it for, of course, today. So I'll see you Wednesday. So y'all take care. Oh, don't forget, by the way, if anybody out there sees this lecture, of course, don't forget the presidential election is tomorrow, Tuesday. And if you if you're registered to vote, make sure you vote. So take care. So that's it for today.